topic tonight is the corporate influence on politics. And I was kind of, in a sense, came to that topic because it's one of the, or it was the highest ranked concern in surveys done around the Occupy the Debates, the people's forum that's being organized to coincide with and present an alternative to the presidential debates. So this, in surveys, was the #1 concern. And so I was thinking about what people might want to think about and talk about. I came up with 5 points. None of them are like simple points. They're not simple facts, but they're more like 5 different ways of thinking about this issue. Some of them are typical and some of them may be not typical. They basically have to do with power, personhood, money, culture, and resistance. And so let me just start with the power. So the first thing that I think everyone should know when thinking about corporate influence on politics is the difference between private and public power. Basically here we're talking about the power of private capital, of private property, of private interests, in a sense insinuating itself into what is supposed to be a realm of public power, public will, public good, right? In the representational system, an electoral system, the idea is, whether or not, regardless of your feelings about that system, the idea is that the people, in a sense, alienate their right to speak and act and legislate for themselves to a representative who will represent their will in legislative acts. And so there is a sense of giving over that power to some representative who's then going to vote and write legislation, and that the influence of money in politics is somehow thwarting or undermining or corrupting that transference of the people's will into the representatives, right? And thus into legislation. So that's usually, often we think of it kind of viscerally, like as a problem, but sometimes we don't think about it in terms of 2 different forms of power, right? And the critique then is that we have private interests undermining public power when this institution is exactly defined by and justified by its ability to exclude private interests and represent the universal or public will, right? That's the whole point of the political system in a liberal democratic system, is to exclude the private and represent the public, right? There are other realms of our lives where private interests are represented and at play, but government is not supposed to be one of them. Now, for corporations, the corporate influence is to, in a sense, create, through legislation, through its purchasing power, regulatory regimes and institutional configurations that facilitate its private appropriation, right? Capital accumulation, right? This is the point, the purpose, the function of the corporate influence on politics, is to determine political outcomes that will facilitate, expand, aggregate private interests, right? So, I've used the Trojan horse analogy before. Basically, like, you have corporate power, the private power of capital, in a sense masquerading as something else to insinuate itself into the democratic spaces of democratic politics in order to be a player in that space. And that's where we're going to see the importance of corporate personhood and Citizens United, et cetera, right? So the conclusion of the first point is basically there's 2 different kinds of powers we need to think about that have 2 different kinds of logics, and they have 2 different kinds of outcomes. And they're in conflict, right? They're conflicting with each other. And I have this quote here from Thomas Jefferson. I don't think I put it on the handout, but Jefferson wrote that about the American political system, that the poorest laborer stood as millionaire, end quote. So the idea is that we may have inequalities everywhere else, but when we come into the political realm, we are all equals. We are one person, we are one vote, right? But we find that the political system actually has inverted that relationship, so we see actually private interest reigning and the public interest having difficulty getting a legislative foothold, so to speak. Right? Okay, so that's the first point. The second point that I think is important for people to know is the significance of corporate personhood and the Citizens United decision. Now, this has created a lot of public support in the sense of a resistance movement to try to overturn Citizens United. There was something decisive about Citizens United in that it was like the final straw that broke the camel's back. It was just the last step in kind of corporate power grab. And I think something happened in kind of public consciousness. But what I also want to say at some point tonight, I want to move away from that and say it's significant, but actually there are even more significant influences of corporate power. And so we want to recognize what Citizens United does and corporate personhood does, but we don't want that to distract us from the other ways that corporations and, in a sense, private capital exercises power over politics. Okay, so despite Jefferson's kind of mythical idea of everyone is an equal in the political system, he was actually also very astute about the threats that corporations posed to the political system. Of course, we have to remember that in Jefferson's time, a very, very small fraction of the population could vote. We're talking about white propertied males, right? So Jefferson is a slave owner, women can't vote. I mean, we have a very small population. But Jefferson, so keep that in mind when we read something like Jefferson's concern about corporate power. So he writes, this is the quote, "I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance of the laws of the country." So this was Jefferson in 1816 recognizing that even for the very small privileged minority of white propertied males, corporations actually threatened to undermine their political will, right? Okay. So let me say a little bit about what this corporation is, what corporate personality is, and then Citizens United. So, you know, most of us are aware that corporation is a legal entity. It has liabilities, it has responsibilities, it has rights and privileges. The corporate form has been evolving over many centuries. The commercial corporation, a large corporation, was really started to colonize North America. Most of the American colonies were run actually by corporations. That was the form of government. It was a corporation. Corporations were constituted by acts of parliament and monarchs in order to further the private interests, economic interests of them or of the church, for example. And this is really the modern form of the corporation that we see today, something of a Frankenstein of power and privilege masquerading as personhood. And Justice Stevens, for example, described in the Citizens United case, in his dissent, he described corporations as having no consciences, no beliefs, no feelings, no thoughts, and no desires, right? So they have rights, but they have no embodiment, no moral consciousness, no beliefs. They're constructed to do one thing, which is to increase private profit, right? Okay, so corporate personhood was not established by Citizens United. What Citizens United did was, in a sense, unleash the power of corporations even more. What it did is it recognized that corporate money is constitutionally protected speech. Now, how does that work? So we have to work our way backwards, right? So the money became constitutionally protected speech in Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976, right? So we have a Supreme Court decision that says that money is speech. That's the first step. The second step is that we have to get the recognition of personhood, right? you have to be a person to have a constitutional right. That means corporations have to gain constitutionally recognized personhood in order to exercise a First Amendment right. That came, well, it's based in the 14th Amendment, which was the inclusion of former slaves into the American polity, granting them citizenship. But what the 14th Amendment did, unfortunately, was in some of its clauses, it just wrote person. It didn't write citizen or natural person. And there was this fictive entity called person or personhood in the legal code that corporations used. It was some entity that had, liabilities and privileges, but it was never considered a constitutional person. So 14th Amendment is passed in 1868. It clearly is referring to African Americans in the United States to address white supremacy and racial injustice. But corporations start immediately bringing cases to the Supreme Court to argue that corporations are persons under that amendment, under the 14th Amendment. And about 16, 18 years later, we get a court case where that happened, right? And that should be on that, that's Santa Clara County. The interesting thing about this decision is that it actually did not decide whether or not corporations were persons. The court recorder described the case after it was adjudicated as having settled the question of corporate personhood. So the decision itself in Santa Clara County did not recognize corporate personhood. Someone in the court, you write descriptions on all of the court decisions, head notes they're called, that summarize them so people who research them can look and find what that court case was about. And it's said in there, and I have it on the handout. The court reporter wrote, who, by the way, was a former head of a railroad company, and this was about railroads paying taxes. It said, the head note said, the court does not wish to hear argument on the question whether the provision in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids a state to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, applies to these corporations. So they don't want to hear that. Why? We all are of the opinion that it does, end quote. So what this did, it was in a sense a false precedent, because then subsequent Supreme Court decisions referenced this as the outcome of Santa Clara County, and thus as a precedent to recognize corporations as persons. This was huge, because then what that did is that brought constitutional rights to personhood for corporations. So corporations now had some constitutional protections, some constitutional powers, right? Okay, so going back to Citizens United, why is this significant? What was Citizens United about? It recognized that corporations as persons with constitutional rights, given Buckley v. Vallejo that money is speech, therefore cannot have their speech or money limited in political spending. Corporations can spend an unlimited amount of money to affect elections. There were limitations on direct contributions to candidates, but this is the birth of the super PAC, right? So you go one step removed from the candidate, and you can pour unlimited funds into that super PAC, which then spends on television ads and literature and documentaries and anything it can imagine to try to affect the outcome of the election. So that's the significance of Citizens United. It, in a sense, lifted the gate in corporate money to go nearly direct enough into elections, right? Okay, so now I want to go to the third point. And the third point is what we should know, I think, are facts about spending and methods of influence. There's, Citizens United, like I said, was kind of a watershed moment. It really activated a lot of people to, in a sense, start resisting corporate power or seeing it as a great threat. But it really only affected one or two ways that corporations can influence elections. Right? There was the creation of the super PACs, and then there were the creation of these social welfare groups, which I love, like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the NRA, Karl Rove's Crossroads groups. These are all social welfare groups, and they can spend as much money as they want unregulated, right? So this is what we always see in the news. This is what we always read in the papers. This how much money is being dumped in there, right? So, and this is incredibly important, but it's the form of influence that's directly under the spotlight of, in a sense, public scrutiny. And I think, and I want to, try to argue this point throughout, is that if we focus just on that, it is big, but if we focus just on that, we will miss all of the other dimensions of corporate influence. And I would say that it's all those other dimensions of corporate influence that is preventing us from really addressing the problem. These are more systemic, insidious, cultural forms of corporate ideology and propaganda that, in a sense, weaken forms of resistance and keep us from focusing on solutions that might change fundamental dynamics in our political system. If we focus only on the Citizens United issue, then we are focusing only on contributions to electoral politics. And that's not the end of politics. That's just one moment of politics. Okay, so let me then turn to the fourth point, which are these other ways, all right? The other thing we need to know is we need to recognize these other ways that corporations, in a sense, affect not just our ability to express political will, but our sense of self, our political imagination, our cultural norms. This is all, in a sense, pervaded by corporate influence and ideology, which, in a sense, prevents us from having what I would call more, truly democratic politics, more horizontal politics, non-commodified politics. So let me just list some of the ways that, some of the mechanisms that corporations influence politics outside of direct contributions to campaigns or elections. Obvious one, lobbying groups, forming big lobbying groups. Second one, you produce or fund groups that will create model legislation. This was a great innovation in the 80s and 90s on the right, corporate funded, and they produced model legislation. This is pre-ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which became like the mother of all kind of model legislation factories for corporations. There were previously think tanks funded all over the country to produce legislation, very complicated legislation, that would then go directly to the politicians, and they would say, don't you worry about it, The telecommunications company wrote the legislation for telecommunications regulation, and the American Petroleum Institute produced legislation to regulate oil and gas extraction, et cetera, right? So this is very, very, very important and has had a huge impact. The other way that think tanks operate is you fund a think tank to produce journalists and commentators. All right? Most of the blowhard kind of commentators that we see are coming out of think tanks. They're being trained. They're being trained and they're being funded deliberately to, in a sense, populate what masquerades as kind of public discourse in the United States so that they can give a unified message, a pro-corporate message, right? And this is to say nothing of actually producing studies, books, articles, etc., and disseminating them. The Heritage Foundation is like the greatest example of this, like fully funded, hundreds of millions of dollars for a budget. They fund authors, speakers, writers, and political cultures permeated by their products. Can also fund chairs, institutes, and centers at universities. This is a very effective way to, in a sense, colonize spaces of research and collaboration and push them toward corporate ends, right? So just this year, the University of Colorado, Denver has the J.P. Morgan Center for Commodities, financial commodities, like credit default swaps, right? $5.5 million was given by J.P. It's the only one in the country, is right here in Denver, at my institution, to fund the study of financial commodities. What are they doing? The J.P. Morgan invented the credit default swap in the early 90s. They invented it. What did they do? They got a bunch of physicists and mathematicians and engineers, and they came up with these mechanisms, these commodities, that were incredibly difficult to understand and unpack, right, to assess risk. And these are, in large part, what brought down the financial industry, the financial sector, in 2007, 2008, right? So now J.P. Morgan is funding university studies to come up with different financial commodities like credit default swaps, right? Okay. I'm very upset about that one. I'm trying to raise $10,000 for a social justice scholarship, and J.P. Morgan just gave $5.5 million for the study of financial commodities. Okay, another one, and we're all familiar with this, funding AstroTurf, political groups, creating fake rallies, paying people to come and demonstrate, right? Creating the perception of a grassroots movement that's supporting corporate policies, right? So all of a sudden you get the, people popping up all over the country opposing climate change legislation. Legislation is talking about climate change. All of a sudden it ends up released memo from the American Petroleum Institute that these people were all paid, they were employees, they were retirees, there was a call out, they were bussed in, right? These are AstroTurf. Okay. Public relations firms. This one really bothers me. They all really bother me, actually. But this one, where you pay people to write book reviews, make blog posts, comment on articles on newspaper websites. You pay people to go out and give the same message over and over. Hundreds of millions of dollars are paid producing fake reviews on Amazon and fake blog posts and fake critiques. Fake in the sense that they're paid to do this, to give the same message over and over, right? So what it does is when you go to a site and you think, wow, there's a debate happening. Is there really climate change? I'm not sure. Or is there any way to stop it? Or what's the source of it? I'm not sure. There seems to be a lot of debate. People are very passionate about this. There are rallies going on everywhere. Okay, couple more ways. One, you actually pay kind of pivotal or important figures in political life or actual politicians for books. I give you $1 million for a book advance, you write a book. Second way to give them money is then you buy 1 million copies of that book and they get royalties. And that's not regulated, right? And it becomes a bestseller, right? So this always happens. All of these political books, like Sarah Palin writes a book, it's a #1 bestseller. It's not a #1 bestseller, just maybe her first one was. I don't know. For the most part, they're usually never bestsellers. They don't make the New York Times bestseller list. They're actually purchased in the hundreds of thousands by corporations. And then they just give them out at fundraisers or what have you, or just burn them. It doesn't matter. But that money then goes to the candidate, and it looks like there's a popular support that people are reading these books, right? Okay. And now let me just talk about a few more of the more insidious things. The appropriation of symbols of resistance and their commodification. All right? So as soon as any symbol rises to, in a sense, capture the moment of a countercultural movement or a subcultural movement or a form of resistance, the advertising industries will appropriate that and turn it into a way, into a commodity, a brand, right? So we are constantly, in a sense, struggling to keep a more authentic form of symbolism in our symbolic world to represent social movements like Occupy, because they're constantly being appropriated and commodified, right? And this is not small. This is very big. And we all know that, for example, 99% has been, as soon as you come up with any slogan or any symbols, they get appropriated, right? So you have to constantly fight for symbolic representation. Mass-produced, depoliticized popular entertainment. We're inundated with forms of entertainment that seem to have no traction in the political world. They don't reflect, or just the opposite. They're always trying to deflect from struggles, suffering, pain, questions, anxiety, right? Resistance. Another form is of mass entertainment that pushes pro-corporate values, right? So we have all of these, superheroes, except for Spider-Man, are always millionaires or billionaires. It's important. Spider-Man is an exception. He's like the working class superhero. But usually, we have this. It's always like, look at the Batman series, very, very popular series, right? It's the billionaire who takes it upon himself to save people. And in the last, I do. Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan's like the perfect Robin, actually. For example, Paul Ryan. So this idea that, probably you've heard this, like what's in his playlist in his iPod, right? First iPod Youth, second playlist, what is it? Rage Against the Machine, right? Paul Ryan is saying, I have Rage Against the Machine on my iPod. That's an appropriation. For many of us, Rage Against the Machine is raging against the system, right? It was a cultural expression of resistance. It fed into a movement, right? And Paul Ryan appropriated that and said, while I'm reading Rand, I'm listening to Rage Against the Machine. Isn't that wonderful, right? And one other form is the targeting of younger and younger demographics and commercializing their lives, their cultures, right? So just like any drug, the younger you get them acculturated or assimilated to certain ways of thinking, certain concepts, certain worldviews, the more difficult it's going to be to dislodge that perspective, right? So we have the commodification of younger and younger children's lives. So it's just natural. They grow up in a corporate commodified world. That's how they express themselves. That's how their world is mediated, is through these corporations. Okay, my last point. It's important to know what we can do now and how we should think about organizing for the future. Right? Now this one is the live issue of voting. There's a live debate going on about whether or not we should vote. So given everything I just said about how corrupt the institution is, how much power corporations have, it's, of course, understandable that people would say, we should just say, basta, no vote, enough. The whole system's corrupt, fuck it, right? This is an illusion, and I'm not going to participate anymore, right? But I want to argue against that. I want to argue against that, at least in this case, because I don't see a vote boycott either extracting or causing political damage to adversaries or empowering the movement, right? If it doesn't do either of those, then we have to question, why would we do it? If it's not harming an adversary or empowering us, why do it? What is the outcome that we want? So that's why I would say, if you can come up with reasons why it would, then I think there's a real discussion to be had there. But if they don't, then I think we should vote. And there are reasons to vote. So the first one is that there are traditionally marginalized groups who are still disenfranchised. And there is a concerted effort, a pro-corporate, anti-democratic effort to disenfranchise more people. And any social movement that wants to grow must recognize the privilege in a vote boycott when there are millions of people being disenfranchised. right? You have to recognize that idea that it's a privilege to not vote when others are struggling to try to vote. And we should also recognize that in building a movement, we need to build and grow with allies. We need to build coalitions. We need to work with other groups around other issues. And doing a vote boycott when there is a concerted national effort to disenfranchise people burns bridges when we should be building them. Okay, so that's the first point. I see some skepticism in the audience. I'm looking forward to Q&A. Second, there's this idea that if we don't try to change things, like reform efforts through voting, whatever might come of voting, maybe you get a slightly better tax code, slightly fairer tax code or something. That, in a sense, is just staving off or postponing the inevitable. And so actually what you want to do is you want to withdraw, accelerate the rate of worsening conditions, like make things worse quicker in order to trigger resistance and maybe even revolutionary action, right? And this is an old debate. This has gone on in radical movements since there were radical movements, right? Do you ever participate in any kind of forms of reform that because they might somehow slow down or prevent or draw attention away from more radical and necessary actions and changes, right? And in my experience and in my understanding of history, I can come up with no examples where intentionally worsening conditions produced a successful social movement. There's no question that crises and worse conditions trigger acts of resistance, uprisings. But if there's not an organization there, they dissipate and they don't accumulate, right? There's no organization to take them forward, to expand upon them, to build upon them. So you get Bush starts a war, threatens to start a war in Iraq, 2003. We see the biggest social protest movement, anti-war movement in history, and before the war. This is incredible. We've never had this before, right? The war starts. People work on it, and become demoralized. Dissipates, right? There was a radical alter-globalization movement before 9/11. 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan killed it. All the energy that was going into that went into anti-war movement, right? I'm just giving these as examples of what can happen when there's a crisis, but there's not an organization to capture the outrage, the anxiety, and build for a different world, right? Sometimes it can have the opposite effect. It can completely demoralize people and make them feel totally helpless, right? So that's my answer to the idea that if we just let things get worse, we might have radical change. The third one is, I think, if we completely disabuse ourselves, completely purge ourselves of the idea that voting is democratic or voting will provide us with political solutions, then we can look at voting as just an instrumental act, right? It's just a choice that we can make because that choice has different outcomes. People say candidates are all the same, right? That's clearly not true. There are a lot of similarities, but it's clearly not true that they're the same, right? I'll give some examples. But so the important point here is that making a choice gives you a certain set of opportunities, not solutions, opportunities, from the perspective of a social movement, right? And they can be positive or negative. A positive example, for example, is public transportation. If a platform or a candidate is pushing public transportation, your vision as a social movement is to have more social goods, the provision of more social goods. Public transportation is a big element for you. That would be a positive. You're creating a set of opportunities by that vote that allows you to build upon this small effort probably toward more public transportation. A negative one, for example, is to remove an issue from the table, right? So I would say for me, the biggest one is choice, is abortion. So I don't think that it would be good for Occupy, for example, to spend the rest of my life probably providing safe, underground, illegal abortion clinics when it could be doing other things, because abortion becomes illegal depending on outcomes of elections. So you could take that off the table, or at least increase the chances of taking that off the table, so that you can focus your energy and time as a social movement on other issues, right? It's just about opportunities. It's about putting things on the table or taking things off the table, and always from the perspective of a social movement. Because voting is not going to change. Voting is just one element in a larger kind of political bag of strategies and opportunities. But to turn away from it and turn away from the disenfranchised, I think undermines the movement. It doesn't allow you to, in a sense, set yourself up with better opportunities for successful movement politics. And then I just want to end, which is on that last, the longer term, right, is the only way for more radical political change is through social movements. That's it. There is no other way. And so we need to organize. And I know, Occupy is coming up on its first year anniversary, and for Occupy, a year is amazing because so much was happening so quickly. We counted it almost in weeks or days. It was just, everything was happening so quickly. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this is the first step in a very, very long movement, right? And so, I would advocate not getting distracted by, for example, voting and presidential politics. You do the analysis, you decide which vote would increase the opportunities for a more successful movement for the issues that you're concerned with. You cast that vote, but more importantly, you keep building the movement. You build, you educate, you organize, you develop alternative institutions, you train each other on how to be successful organizers and activists, and you build, and you build, and you build. And it takes a long time. But that's the only way that we're really going to, in a sense, push back against these more insidious forms of corporate influence and actually be able to utilize what little opportunities are presented through electoral politics. Right? At least that's what I would say. So I'll end there, and now I'm curious to hear the response. Let things get worse. People thought that, I'm a bit older. I've been through several cycles of social movements and participated in several social movements and seen this. And take, for example, I think Wisconsin is an excellent example. So you get Scott Walker doing something audacious and cruel and unbelievable, just an exertion of executive power to destroy unions. And you got this massive, beautiful, inspirational uprising. Gorgeous. I loved it. I'm from Wisconsin, so I loved it. And then what happened? They poured all of their money into electoral politics. The unions. They didn't organize outside. They put all of their energy into electoral politics. And they lost. And they became fucking demoralized. It's unbelievable. The depression on the left in Wisconsin is incredible. And that's the problem. It isn't that the voting is the problem. It's the thinking that someone is going to be a savior. No one's going to be a savior. No one's going to solve anything, right? But some people are not going to go after abortion rights, and some people are going to do that, or some people are going to do some, what have you, community gardens, public parks, something, and you can either put that on your table of issues or you can take that off, right? And so the idea is that voting is not a solution at all. But it happens, and there are outcomes, and those outcomes produce opportunities for a movement. So that's the idea. I think Wisconsin was a beautiful disaster because that two-prong approach. You vote, but you organize a movement outside of electoral politics. It interacts with electoral politics, but the unions didn't realize that.
I don't understand. Can you give us an example of what you mean outside of electoral politics? How do you do that
Occupy? Occupy, for example. Yeah. Like, I think, literally, I think that there was a successful social movement, and we owe it to them. That there was a successful social movement that made it legal to have an abortion in this country. That's the outcome of a social movement. And now we're saying it doesn't matter. And if that becomes illegal, then I, at least, am going to spend the rest of my fucking life fighting for the right of a woman to have an abortion safely. Right? I don't want to do that. Legally, at least, it's won. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to go back. So I want to take that off the table and continue to fight patriarchal, right-wing Christian fascist bullshit that's like undermining women in this country. That's a struggle we can continue to have. But right now, we don't have to fight for the legality of abortion. And this election might put that back on the table as an issue that the social movement, again, must deal with. So that's what I mean. I don't want Occupy to have to deal with that. Can you take